Hello everyone, this is the first video of the Fiscal Policy series, which is part of Unit 2.4 of the IB Economics Macroeconomics syllabus. In this video, I'm going to talk about the government budget. So let's get started. So, in order to understand the government budget, we have to talk about the sources of government revenue and the types of government expenditure. So, what are the sources of government revenue? Where does the government get its revenue? Well, the first is taxes. Taxes can be direct, which are all taxes on the incomes of the factors of production and wealth, or indirect taxes, which are taxes on expenditure on goods and services. The government can also get revenue from the sale of goods and services, like providing postal services or nationwide railway operators. Governments themselves sell goods and services, and so the money they receive from selling goods and services is part of the government revenue. The last source of government revenue is the sale of government-owned or state-owned enterprises. Sometimes governments decide to sell businesses that have traditionally been owned by the government to the private sector. This is a process known as privatization. So these are the three main sources of government revenue. Right, types of government expenditure. So we've looked at where the government gets its revenue. What does the government spend its money on? The first is current expenditure. So current expenditure refers to spending on goods and services that are consumed within the current budget year or fiscal year. For example, the wages and salaries of government employees. Capital expenditure refers to long-term government investments that are aimed at increasing the economy's productive capacity. So whenever the government invests in infrastructure, building a new road, building a new highway, building a new airport, this is part of the government's capital expenditure. Governments also spend money on transfer payments. These are welfare payments that are made without corresponding return, without a corresponding exchange of a good or a service. For example, giving unemployment benefits to the unemployed, pensions to the elderly, paying child allowances to single parents. These are the main types of government expenditure, either current expenditure, capital expenditure, or transfer payments. So, the budget outcome. We've looked at the sources of government expenditure and the types of, the sources of government revenue and the types of government expenditure. If government revenue is equal to government expenditure, we say there's a balanced budget. This is the most ideal situation. You are spending exactly how much you have in revenue. Now, when government revenue is greater than government expenditure for the current fiscal year, we say that there's a budget surplus. This happens a lot during booms when taxes are high and transfer payments are generally low. Not a lot of people are unemployed and so on. Budget deficits, on the other hand, a budget deficit occurs when the government revenue is less than the government expenditure. The government is spending more than it has in revenue for the current fiscal year. This might happen maybe during a recession when taxes are generally low and transfer payments are generally high. Lots of people are losing their jobs, and so a lot of unemployment benefits. Ideally, the government wants to maintain a balanced budget, but there could also be a budget surplus when revenue exceeds expenditure, or a budget deficit when expenditure exceeds revenue. Now, a budget deficit, which is a situation where your expenditure exceeds your revenue, how are you going to finance that? Well, it requires government borrowing. The government has to borrow in order to pay for this increased expenditure that exceeds its revenue, and therefore budget deficits will increase the public debt. Budget deficits and increasing the public debt is very expensive because on these loans that you take out, you have to pay interest on these loans. So there are interest charges on these loans. Essentially, the national or public or government debt is an accumulation of budget deficits. So the total government national debt is the total of all the previous budget deficits where the government had to borrow money. And that's why continuously having budget deficits is politically unpopular. The government is forced to borrow, which can be a little bit of a problem. Now, budget surpluses, on the other hand, a situation where the government revenue exceeds government expenditure, will decrease the public debt because generally, when there is a budget surplus, the government will use that surplus to pay back some of its debt. So, budget surpluses will decrease the public debt caused by budget deficits in the previous years. However, budget surpluses can be unpopular with taxpayers because taxpayers might start thinking, why are you taking so much in taxes, even though you don't need to spend it? Well, maybe cut tax rates. So it's also politically unpopular. It's really hard work being the government because if you have continuous budget deficits, no one's happy. If you have continuous budget surpluses, no one is happy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this video.